Hello, everyone, and welcome to Raya Affairs. My name is Nicola, and I'll be your host for this episode. Raya is a youth-led international think tank that translates the abstract world of international affairs by simplifying rather than generalizing. Raya is a place where you come to learn about the stories and worries of political leaders, the behind-the-scenes of decision-makers, and how politics impacts and changes your life. This is Raya Affairs, filling you in wherever you are. As always, I would like to start with a disclaimer that expressed opinion in this episode are welcome, even though they are not a direct reflection of Raya, as we specialize in unbiased writing. In today's episode, we will be talking about the President of Somaliland, Muse Bihi, and the controversial Memorandum of Understanding between Somaliland and Ethiopia that was announced at the beginning of this year. So joining me today is Ángel Rodríguez Moreno, who recently wrote an article on this topic. Hello, Ángel. Thank you very much for joining me. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course, Nico. So thank you for having me here. So my name is, as you said, Ángel, and I'm from a little town called Segovia in Spain. I studied business administration and international relations, and I'm currently in the research analysis team. That's why I had a wonderful opportunity of writing this article. I previously worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then I have done several projects for the organizations, specializing in sustainable development and innovation.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Ángel. And before we start to talk about today's topic, I'll ask you our usual ice-breaking question. So could you tell us which leader, either dead or alive, who has impacted the world, would you want to have a conversation with, and why?
That's a great question. So, I think the one that I would choose would be Lee Kuan Yew, who was it's the former Prime Minister of Singapore. Why? Because first I had a chance of doing my exchange there, so I have a lot of memories of being in Singapore, a country that I really admire and love. And then I would love to have a conversation with him because he managed to take a country which is super small, which didn't have anything, and make it one of the most prosperous nations in the world, while embracing diversity and cohesion.
Wow, that's really, really interesting. Thank you very much, Ángel. And now with this, I would say that we can start our conversation about your article. So first of all, could you please give us a brief overview of the history of this country, Somaliland, which is kind of a unique case in the region?
Of course, I'll try to be brief with the history facts. So, Somaliland, as you said, is an exception. So, Somaliland is a de facto country, which means that it's not recognized by the international community. But due to some contextual political factors, it does operate as an independent state. Somaliland has its own police force, constitution, institutional structure, even its own currency and flag. De facto states are unstudied cases in global affairs, but they are not uncommon, actually. In fact, we can see other quasi or de facto states in regions such as the Caucasus or the Middle East, where we have, for example, the Turkish Republic or Northern Cyprus, or the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. Most of these states are the result of everlasting wars, and Somaliland is no exception. Back when Europe decided to partition Africa, Somalis living in the Horn of Africa were separated under three different jurisdictions: Italian Somalia, British Somalia, and some who were left in Abyssinia, nowadays Ethiopia. So Somaliland back then was a British protectorate. But in 1960, when they gained independence, they decided to join Italian Somaliland to form the Somali Republic, a united Somali nation. But just before uniting with the former Italian Somalia, people in Somaliland voted on a constitution that would facilitate this union. But in the referendum, there was already a significant majority of Somalis in Somaliland who expressed skepticism because they feared that they could face marginalization in this new Somalia. However, despite these concerns affecting the voting, the union proceeded. But it didn't turn out great as envisioned, and due to economic neglect, political marginalization, and repression by the government, there was huge discontent in the north. And then when the country of Somalia started the civil war, and and then they decided to gain independence. We must remember that Siad Barre, so the dictator at that time, exerted a lot of violence against northern Somalis, so those who live in Somaliland. And in reaction, they formed the Somali National Movement to oppose Barre's government. This led to bombings and destruction, such as in the case of the bombing of Hargeisa, which nowadays some people even frame it as Africa's Dresden. So yeah, Barre's government collapsed, and in 1991, they decided to declare independence from Somalia. And since then, they have been a sovereign state, but not recognized by the international community.
Okay, thank you, Angel. And now that we have a better understanding of the historical context, could you tell us what this Memorandum of Understanding between Somaliland and Ethiopia is, and why is it so controversial?
Well, we need to understand that the Memorandum of Understanding is just the icing on the cake of President Bihi's plan to achieve international recognition. So, since his election in 2017, Bihi's top priority has been to increase the bargaining power of Somaliland in the region through smart diplomacy, which means using both hard and soft power to gain influence. So his path to recognition involves several stakeholders that we will talk about later on, I'm sure. But the main alliance that vertebrates his smart diplomacy involves the UAE and Ethiopia. So, on the one hand, why Ethiopia? So, Ethiopia is the middle power by excellence in the Horn of Africa. The country hosts around 130 million people, which translates into immense opportunities for trade and economic growth. But Ethiopia faces an existential challenge, which is that it's a landlocked nation. The country used to utilize Eritrea as the main trade route to export and import goods until 1990s, when Eritrea fought for its independence in a bloody war. And then, since that moment, Addis Ababa has depended around 90% of its exports on the hyper-militarized port of Djibouti. And then we have the UAE. So the UAE has been growing interests in the Middle East and the Horn of Africa. So the country needed a port that offered them control over maritime trade at the Bab al-Mandab Strait, which connects the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, which, as we all know, is strategically important. That's why in 2017, just before President Bihi took power, DP World, Dubai Ports World, signed a 30-year concession agreement with Somaliland to manage and develop the Berbera port, with $500 million investment. And in strengthening relations with Somaliland, the UAE built a military base in Berbera where they can control, for example, the Houthis on the other side of the coast, among other security advantages. So, with the support of the UAE on the port and Ethiopia over the roads, the three parties decided to build what we now call the Berbera Corridor, connecting Berbera to Ethiopia through the town of Wajale. So, as you can see, President Bihi's smart diplomacy involves some sort of quid pro quo. He'll give some resource in exchange of international recognition, right? So the Memorandum of Understanding is just another final step in this process. What does the Memorandum of Understanding involve? So this grants Ethiopia access to the sea, giving them a 20-kilometer shoreline for its naval forces under a 50-year lease. And in return, Ethiopia has agreed to recognize Somaliland as an independent state, marking the first instance a UN member state will extend recognition to Somaliland.
And in your article, you mentioned that this deal even led to the resignation of Somaliland's defense minister and triggered protests all across the country. So why did this specific agreement have such an impact on the political atmosphere in Somaliland? And especially, what are the consequences for President Bihi's leadership?
Well, the consequences are direct because we now face elections in Somaliland. Those elections will happen right now in November. And in fact, now the Memorandum of Understanding needs some sort of public opinion effect, right? To embrace him towards this election. But for the public opinion, the agreement is controversial because of two main reasons. So first, Ethiopia is not a reliable partner. We've seen instances where Ethiopia failed to commit to the expectations. For example, around the Berbera Corridor agreement, they lost its 90% stake in the port due to some unmet agreed conditions on the construction of roads. And we must remember the Memorandum of Understanding is just a letter of intent. Therefore, President Bihi cannot ensure that Addis Ababa will fulfill its commitments in the arrangement. On the other hand, Somalis across the Horn of Africa face historical grievances with Ethiopia. So this can actually have a huge effect in how Somalis interact with other ethnicities, primarily Oromos, the core of Ethiopian society, in different aspects, such as trade. For example, in 2022, Addis Abeba's decision to double the price of hut, crop ranking fourth in Ethiopian export revenue, sparked violence between the two ethnicities, Oromos and Somalis. And in response, the Somaliland Hut Association banned hut imports from Ethiopia. So this is just another example how relationship between Somalis in either Somaliland or Somalia are very vulnerable when it comes to Ethiopia.
Okay, well, this explains why this memorandum of understanding is actually like a central issue in Somaliland and for the Somaliland's political atmosphere right now. But if this is actually hurting President Bihi's leadership, why do you think he chose to push forward with this deal, especially considering that, as you mentioned in your article, Somaliland is facing many other political and economic problems?
Well, exactly. That seems the obvious question, right? Like, why is he doing this? So, doing some analysis, I find two reasons. So, the first one is the path to recognition that we mentioned, right? So, President Bihi has been fighting since his election very hard to get this international recognition. That's the main priority in his policy. And he achieved many successes. So, we need to understand that apart from, for example, the UAE and Ethiopia, he has been engaging with another different sorts of powers and players, not only in the region but globally, such as Taiwan. So Taiwan CPC Corporation, for example, holds 50% of the stake in an oil block in Somaliland, and the country has even stepped in to provide financial aid, for example, in the destruction of the Wahin market, which is one of the biggest catastrophes that the country faced recently. And then we can even have regional actors involved, such as Kenya. So in 2021, Kenya appointed 4 offices to its liaison office in Hargeisa, the capital of Somaliland. And these include the deployment of diplomatic officials, which, as we know, we can sort of understand that it's towards achieving, eventually, international recognition. So, on the other hand, the reason is that the country, as I mentioned in the article, faces economic and political challenges. Because he has been so successful in this path to recognition, he attempted to achieve this memorandum of understanding and finalize it to divert attention from these economic and political obstacles.
Yes, this makes a lot of sense, actually. And can you tell us a bit more about these economic and political challenges? Like, what are they and how are they influencing President Bihi's credibility and support, especially because, as you said, the country is very soon going to presidential elections?
Exactly. So let's talk first about the political one. So Somaliland is a unique exception in the Horn of Africa because, contrary to its counterpart in the Horn of Africa, Somalia, they have been praised as a unique example of good governance, receiving nicknames such as the Oasis of Stability or Democratic Miracle in the Horn of Africa. However, tensions between the central core clan, which is the Isaac clan that vertebrates Somaliland's society, and other peripheral groups have escalated quickly when President Bihi in 2022 decided to delay elections for 2 more years amid some sort of financial constraint Okay, so that triggered protests in peripheral communities that then escalated into war in the city of Lasanot. This war is not solved yet, and in fact, the communities that live in eastern Somaliland form a new autonomous entity, which is the SSC Hatumo, and declared independence from Somaliland to reunify with Somalia. Because in fact, the main clan, the Durbahande clan, which is central to that area of Somaliland, belongs to parts of Puntland, which is the federal region in the north of Somalia. And now let's talk about the economic one. So livestock, which is the cornerstone of the economy in Somaliland, has been devastated by extensive and continuous droughts for several years now, which have displaced over 1,800,000 people and caused 2/3 of households to lose their animals, leaving traders unable to meet the demand along the Berbera corridor, which, as we must understand, feeds the funds of the Somaliland's government. And the crisis was further compounded in April 2022 when a massive fire destroyed the Wahin market that I was mentioning when Taiwan was providing aid. This market was also key because it served as an economic hub, and it led to an estimated cost of millions of dollars, deepening economic strain in Somaliland, in trade, and overall in the region.
Okay, wow, this seems like a really difficult situation for the country. And now, trying to answer the million-dollar question, given all these economic, political, and social pressures, do you think that this Memorandum of Understanding is actually going to help Somaliland's claim for recognition?
Well, that's indeed the million-dollar question. So we need to go back to the so-called democratic miracle and oasis for stability claim, right? Because this is a claim. Remember that we are talking about smart diplomacy, which involves not only hard power, which in this case is economic or military power, but it also involves soft power. So there are two main claims that President Bihi had to support achieving international recognition. One is that they have the right to independence, to self-determination based on the UN Charter because they used to be British Somaliland, right? However, legally, that's not the case because they united back to Somalia, remember, for a while. But indeed, it's a claim. And then the second claim is that they have proven to be a democratic miracle, good governance. If you recognize Somaliland, you are supporting democracy in the Horn of Africa. You're ensuring that the country has stability and steady economic growth as companies and institutions do not face the legal ambiguity that the country currently faces. That, for example, when you want to provide aid to Somalia through international institutions, that aid doesn't have to go first through Mogadishu to be then distributed, if so, to Somaliland, right? But these claims have been losing a lot of weight because of the situation in Somaliland. As the country moves to a more authoritarian government, because President Bihi, for example, delayed elections because he's now engaging in war against SSC Hatumo, for example, and other peripheral communities, because of this turn that he's having, countries, for example, such as the UK, that used to support the democratic miracle claim or even that supporting Somaliland in any way possible, will now be more reticent towards supporting them, right? So I think, unfortunately, that President Bihi's ambition to get recognition is actually harming them, indeed, to achieve it.
Okay, thank you very much, Angel, for trying to answer this really difficult question. And now I would like to move our attention kind of to the bigger picture. And I wanted to ask you, what could these developments mean for the region as a whole? Meaning, like, could Somaliland's instability have wider implications for the Horn of Africa?
Of course, the Horn of Africa is key to understand the global affairs in general. It's connected to a lot of regions. For example, when we saw the conflict escalating in Sudan, we saw as a lot of implications for the European Union because of, for example, refugees coming across the Mediterranean, right? But for example, with the Middle East, we can see countries such as the UAE or Turkey competing in the Horn of Africa. And I want to talk about Turkey a little bit because it's an actor that usually we forget. It's there. Turkey is the main ally of Somalia when it comes to security, right? So Turkey is competing with the UAE. So if we see that the UAE gets a lot of power because of the Berbera corridor, then we can see also Turkey supporting more and more Somalia. So we can, and that may have even implications in the Middle East, right? And we also need to understand it at a local level. We shouldn't have this development myopia that we often have when it comes to understanding political violence in other countries. We need to understand that if violence escalates in such a vulnerable region such as the Horn of Africa, the power vacuum that will create can be filled up with other actors such as Al-Shabaab. Let's remember, Al-Shabaab is still there, in Somalia indeed, not in Somaliland. But maybe in the future we can see that spreading in Somaliland. In fact, Somaliland is an Islamist in that sense of like how the institutions are built. So we can see that the population does engage with Islam. Why not be more radicalized under a situation of economic and political havoc, right? And I just want to also recommend, there are two marvelous articles in Raya that talk about these cases. So, for example, our peer Ruby wrote an article. It's called Unpacking Hostility, Abiy Ahmed, Ismail Wele, and Red Sea Access. So in that article, she explains a lot this like relationship between middle powers, foreign powers, and the implications not only in the Horn of Africa but elsewhere. And we also have a recent article published by Beatrice Carpani, which is called Mahmoud Called as his war against Al-Shabaab continues. And then you can also understand further how Al-Shabaab plays a key role, as I was mentioning, in the Horn of Africa.
Yes, definitely. And I think that is a great article tackling the issue of fighting terrorism in Somalia. And now my last question is kind of a more specific question, always related to regional security. And I wanted to ask you what the role of Egypt is in this particular situation, because I've been reading many articles talking about the rising tensions between Somalia, Ethiopia, and Egypt, especially regarding the project by Ethiopia to build a dam on the Nile River. And this made Egypt and other downstream countries along the course of the Nile very concerned about the access to resources, considering that the economy of this country most of the time is basically based and centered around the access to the water resources of the Nile. So I wanted to ask you, what implications could this Memorandum of Understanding between Somaliland and Ethiopia have on regional security and alliances, considering these rising tensions between regional players?
Well, I see that Raya does understand the world perfectly because indeed it has a lot of implications. How the construction of the dam by Ethiopia impacts the relationship between Somaliland and other actors, including Egypt. So yes, you're talking about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, so the GERD, which is one of the most controversial policies by Abiy Ahmed. And as you said, it tries to control water resources in Africa, specifically in the Nile, affecting Sudan and Egypt. This process has led to a securitization of freshwater resources, which in a world affected by climate change will be more and more important. Let's remember one of the main problems that Somaliland faced were droughts, right? So water is key, is powerful. So in this regard, we saw also in the podcast that Turkey and the UAE will compete more and more in the Horn of Africa as the UAE gets powerful. Well, it happens the same with Egypt. So we can see Egypt aligning more and more with Somalia. And this has led, for example, to a situation whereby Somaliland has decided to reject Egypt from its potential allies. In fact, in September 2024, Somaliland's government ordered the closure of the Egyptian Cultural Center in Hargeisa, citing, as they said, national security concerns. And Foreign Minister Dr. Essa Kaid announced a 72 hours deadline for the center's staff to depart, alleging involvement in activities compromising national interests. As we saw, we can have a lot of interconnected implications. We can see in the future Egypt and Somalia strengthening the relationship as they try to counterbalance the main two competitors. On the one hand, Somaliland for Somalia, and on the other hand, Ethiopia for Egypt.
Wow, thank you very much, Angel, for this great answer and super in-depth. I would say that with this, we can end today's episode. Thank you very much again for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Nico, for the marvelous podcast. I hope people now can understand a little bit more the situation there.
It has been really great to have this conversation with you, and I think this episode will be particularly interesting for our listeners. And to our listeners, make sure to check out Angel's article at rayagroup.org and to follow us on social media to receive updates on new articles and contents. Thank you very much again for listening, and I'll see you next time.